course, there is a very fast growth of the volumes of philanthropy worldwide, especially in emerging markets that would naturally call for also a stronger ecosystem to support this growth and to guide the private social investments in the best way possible. But at the same time, we observe a certain gap in this infrastructure for philanthropy. And that's something that we have highlighted in the last report that WINGS has published, a new global picture of organizations serving philanthropy, which showed that, well, first of all, the respondents of this research said for 72% that financial sustainability was remaining a challenge for them, whereas 90% of these organizations need grant and this type of support to operate. And we also identified a very concerning fact, which is the uneven distribution of the philanthropy infrastructure worldwide, with 80% of the expenditures in the field made in North America, and for instance, only 5% of these budget goes to for the Asian region and MENA region altogether, where we know that the volumes of philanthropy are very important and growing quickly. So which raises a question. And of course, this infrastructure, this ecosystem, is a sector which is mainly intangible, and that's why naturally it can be overlooked. And it seems there is a need for it to be better understood, and for its value and its added value to be better understood. And so that's why WINGS is committed to raise the profile of a philanthropic ecosystem and support organizations, and raise the question of supporting the field at a more strategic level maybe than it is usually discussed. Not only as a good citizen's contribution for foundations to their field, but also as a strategic investment to leverage the impact of the philanthropic world. So without further delay, I will invite our first speaker to present the perspective of its foundation. So this is Deychakiwsky. He's the Civil Society Program Officer managing Mott's global philanthropy and non-profit sector program areas. Nick is an extremely knowledgeable person about civil society and philanthropy networks, platforms, and infrastructure. And of course, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation is a very long-term supporter of the infrastructure, whether it's in the United States or globally, with significant investments over the past decades. And so we are very excited to hear Nick's perspective on why he thinks supporting the philanthropy infrastructure is important.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you for that kind introduction. Are you hearing me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Okay. Thank you, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're located around the world. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. So, a bit about thinking about infrastructure. I wanted to just set the stage a little bit, in that to say that often it's thought in terms of very large, visible objects, but yet Benjamin used the term intangible, and that's the way I think and prefer to think about it, that these are things that are behind the scenes. If in a building you think of plumbing or wiring, that are invisible, and yet if they are not there, then the building is not a comfortable place to be in, and the functions that it's supposed to do are not fulfilled as much. So I think of that in terms of our organizations that are infrastructure, that they often are behind the scenes, maybe prettier than what we see in these pictures, though. So a quick reminder that there are different types of infrastructure organizations. The ones we are most used to seeing and thinking of are the membership associations, like a European Foundation Center or Council on Foundations, but we have all kinds of others that perform various functions. This is not an exhaustive list. For example, I think one I left off are technology providers. But it's, indeed, as Benjamin said, a larger ecosystem. Sometimes a particular organization can combine several of these functions. Often the best advocacy groups, for example, are the membership associations. But in many cases, different groups work individually. At the Mott Foundation, we have a particular logic model that we use for thinking about infrastructure. I'm waiting for the slide to show. Let me describe it as we're waiting for it to show. And that is that sort of a three-legged stool that for the sector to operate well, we need a healthy policy environment. But we also need good practice and impact. And without a healthy policy environment, you will not get good practice and impact. And without good practice, you will not have the public trust that is needed to give you good policy. Now, in order to drive this kind of cycle, an infrastructure also needs needs good information, quality data and research to support both good policy and good practice. And then there's a set of organization and infrastructure that that drives this. Okay, if you advance another slide, please. There we go. That's the one. Thank you very much. So this is our logic model at the Mott Foundation that we pursue, or the way we think about what infrastructure does. If you can give me the next slide, please. Okay. In the United States, a few years ago, the Foundation Center did a study on funding for infrastructure. You can see the blue line below is specific only to philanthropy. The red line deals with other organizations serving the broader nonprofit sector, and the green line is the total. So if we look at the last column, we get some pretty seemingly significant figures of 134 million total, and then the split between the ones that are just philanthropy and others. If you could advance the slide, please. So those may seem, next slide, please. Yeah, so those may seem like big figures. However, over those time periods, it has been less than 1% of total foundation giving that went for infrastructure. Now, I don't know, it would be an interesting research to do to see what is it in comparable or what's the comparable spending on infrastructure in other areas. For example, the investment industry, how much do they spend on things that help regulate, that are ratings systems and the like, or in the larger corporate world, how much gets spent on various trade associations and chambers of commerce and the like. I suspect the figure is higher. Next slide, please. So I want to take that to give you three recommendations. One follows along with what a public letter from a set of 22 prominent infrastructure organizations in the United States had made a public appeal last year, where they ask foundations to consider spending at least 1% of their giving on philanthropy and or nonprofit sector infrastructure. Now, when that appeal came out, we tallied what the Mott Foundation is supporting, and we came out at 6.5%. But then we actually have a grant-making objective solely to support infrastructure, because we feel it is a critical component of a healthy and effective civil society, and civil society is one of our program areas. But we also recognize that infrastructure, good infrastructure, helps our other program areas such as environment or education, because when the sector overall works better, that in general we will all get a better return on investment in our specific areas. Next slide, please. The other point I'd like to make is that we really should be thinking not only of philanthropy and foundations, but more broadly of civil society, or if you want to call it the charitable sector, or in the UK they say the voluntary sector. In the US we often call it the nonprofit sector, the set of organizations who often are grantees, or through which we as foundations work. And what affects the broader sector really does affect foundations. So we should be thinking of support to them. When nonprofit organizations who receive funding from us are more effective, then that allows us to achieve greater impact as those that fund them. Also, very frequently, the laws on NGOs are applicable to us as well. Another consideration is funding decisions made by government to civil society organizations will very much affect what we as foundations or funders are asked to support. So this is I don't know what the best proportions are. It's different depending on the context in different countries, but just the broader point is think beyond just philanthropy. Next slide, please. And the final point I want to make is that we are more interconnected in the world, but still it can be a lonely existence for infrastructure organizations. They often have few or sometimes no peers locally. They're helped by broad regional or national platforms such as, say, the Daphne in Europe, or the Forum of Regional Associations and Grant Makers in the United States, or WINGS globally. And this helps organizations to overcome the isolation that they might feel because they don't have readily available peer organizations. So when they act together with others, and I'm sorry the second picture is not showing up on the slides, but oops, we jumped. I don't know if you can back up and try this slide again, because it is missing the, no, okay, now go forward. No, sorry, there's just a nice picture in the blank spot of a bunch of people together and smiling, so imagine that visual image. But an infrastructure organization will not only gain knowledge from its peers, but confidence and solidarity. So I hope this has helped set the scene, and I'll be happy to contribute more when we get to a question and answer part. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Nick, for this very interesting presentation. And indeed, I think that we will keep some time at the end of the webinar to have more interaction with the people who are attending the webinar, so that you can also share more insights with them. Now Oksana Oracheva is the General Director of the Vladmir Potanin Foundation, and Oksana is a winner of the Fulbright and Chevening Scholarship Awards, and so our foundation, which is based in Russia, is active also in supporting philanthropy development. And so, of course, it's very interesting, I think, for us to have this perspective from an emerging market economy and a foundation operating in this frame. Why do you think it is strategic or important to invest in your philanthropic ecosystem, and what does it mean for a foundation like yours? So please, Oksana, share with us your experience from the Vladmir Potanin Foundation.
Thank you, Benjamin, for introduction, and good morning or good afternoon or evening for everyone. So I'm trying to speak today on behalf of the Vladmir Potanin Foundation. Next slide, please. This is the Russian foundation that is founded in 1999, and that from the very beginning we decided to have philanthropy development as one of the key areas of our work. So if we have a next slide with our mission statement, you would see that even though we in the center of our mission we have individuals, we at the same time believe that in order for those individuals, today and future leaders, to be successful in their work, it is very important to create a favorable environment for them. And this is not possible without having infrastructure as a supporter in their work. So when almost 20 years ago, it was a choice between the way how the philanthropic activities of our founders should be developing, he make it clearly that the choice is the strategic philanthropy development through institutions and also supported infrastructure as such. We have, in our areas of work, and we work in education and culture, we also see infrastructural support as a key of importance to be successful in all other activities. So we actually developed a special, can we have a next slide please, a special programmatic activities that relate to philanthropy development. And a few years ago, when it was time to organize efforts of foundations working in Russia, we were one of the founding members of the Russia Donors Forum, the first association of donors organizations in Russia. So how do we support infrastructure? And I think it corresponds to what was said by Nick, that there are different areas how we can do it. We work through supported institutions that are like associations that are part of the infrastructure. We believe that both research and education, as well as professional development of people working in the field, is very important. And we support different gatherings and conferences that allow us exchange best practices and ideas, as well as prizes like, for example, Olga Alexeyeva Prize that was introduced almost 5 years ago. But at the same time, we see from a regional perspective, as a foundation that works also at not only on the national level, that there are some very important gaps that doesn't actually allow us to use the infrastructural support very effectively. And I will try to identify those gaps altogether with recommendations for both funders and infrastructural organizations. The first gap, of course, is financial. There is not enough money allocated to infrastructural support. And one way to address this gap is the appeal that was made and Nick described. The other way is to, from the very beginning, especially in emerging countries, emerging economy countries, to involve local donors into setting the field. Because in many places, Russia is not excluded. In many places, the infrastructural support was from the beginning funded and initiated by foreign donors. And the local donors were not involved as such. And later on, it made it difficult for them to step in when the foreign donors are gone. It's, the same problem is with the same gap, I would say, is with, we call the needs gap. When the needs of the infrastructural organizations and other institutions working in the field of philanthropy, NGOs and foundations is constantly changing. The needs are constantly changing. And the problem with infrastructural organizations is twofold. On one hand, they need to be ahead of us, bringing new instruments into the field. On the other hand, they need to correspond to the needs of the organizations that they represent. And I think to address this gap, both sides need to have opportunities to listen to each other and to help each other to understand and identify those needs all the way. The third gap I would like to stress is expectation gap. And that's another question that is very important and maybe less articulated. Whose interests represent infrastructural organizations? Would it be associations or research centers or other type of institutions? Do they represent the needs of the needs of this sector as such, or of individual members? And again, it's a question to both parts of this process. So we need to be very clear what to expect, and we really need to, from both sides, and we really need to know how to manage expectations. It shouldn't be too much expectations from, let's say, funders that infrastructural organizations could change the world in one day. So we need to have a continuous support. It couldn't be a one-time support. And the last area I would like to identify is the issue of agenda, I would say agenda gap. Especially as we can see in recent developments in not only in Russia but in Eastern Europe, there are a lot of new questions coming to the agenda, and it's always an issue whether how to form collective agenda, who is the leader, and how to have a common voice instead of having separate voices. And from this perspective, infrastructural organizations are extremely important. They allow us to form this collective agenda and to demonstrate the common voice. And we can see the recent activities of European Foundation Center when we have resolutions with the event happening in Hungary, for example. But then there is the other side of this. It's who set up this agenda. Is this infrastructural organization itself who says what is the most important and how to resolve the issue, or the role of infrastructural organization is to collect the needs and questions from the members of the field? So my recommendation would be for both sides. First, to spend more time hearing each other, to understand why why support is needed and why this support is significant and how to support. For funders, maybe to include into the project support the core support percentage, for example, because without core support, the infrastructure organizations wouldn't play the role they need to play in the world. And to exchange the ideas, so to not only try to hear to each other, but more important to exchange the views and to provide the feedback. So both sides are behave in a different way. So infrastructural organizations and funders are part of one process, and only being partners in this process, we can really provide opportunities for successful social change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oksana, and apologies for the technical issues with the slides that couldn't show up for some time. I hope we don't have the same issue for the next presentation, but the presentations will be online so that you can access it after this webinar. So thank you very much, Oksana, for this extremely interesting insights with the perspective of the Vladmir Potanin Foundation. So just I'm moving fast between presentations because I think it's important that we keep enough time for discussion and for interaction with the participants of the webinar. So I'm quickly going to invite Megan Scanlon from the Aga Khan Foundation to present her perspective. Megan is the Senior Program Officer for Civil Society at the Aga Khan Foundation USA. And at AKF, she works to strengthen and improve the enabling environment and capacities of civil society in Afghanistan, Pakistan, East Africa, Central Asia, as well as promoting community philanthropy globally. So AKF is also a long-term supporter of the philanthropy development in different regions of the world. And so we look forward to hear your presentation, Megan.
Thank you, Benjamin. And if you, I'm happy to ask you to advance slides, or I can, if you want to give me controls, I'm happy to control it as well. Up to you. So thanks to everyone who joined us today. Just to kind of give a little background on the Aga Khan Foundation, we consider ourselves one of the largest international development organizations in the world. We're an operational foundation, which means in addition to having some of our own funds, which we use to implement development work in Africa and Asia, we also actually implement those work. So we're a decentralized network of offices that is part of a foundation that is part of the broader Aga Khan Development Network, which has the AKDN acronym. I represent the, as a program officer at AKFUSA, I represent in the U.S. our civil society work globally, but in part of a broader network doing that work and representing that work and helping to develop it. So the AKDN overall, which is has social, economic, and cultural development pillars, of which AKF is only one small part, is consider civil society to be the foundation to the work in all of our other sectors, similar to what Nick was describing about Mott Foundation's approach. We work in a very multi-input, multi-sectoral way and see civil society as the basis of all of that work. And so working with civil society, strengthening civil society is integral in all of the different aspects of our work, as well as a particular focus for us. And the kind of core of our work in civil society, and I should say, too, our kind of end goal and really how we measure our success is in our impact on quality of life. So the goal for us is always about finding ways for local people in our very locally rooted offices and the locally rooted work that we do to address their own development needs. If you could advance this slide. So I intentionally use the phrase community philanthropy, even though this is a philanthropy infrastructure presentation, because of how core that concept is to all of our work, including in the work that we do to strengthen the infrastructure for philanthropy. Our sort of founding ethics and our DNA as an organization is rooted in Ismaili Islam ethics of self-sufficiency, service to others, sustainability. So that's really at the core of our motivations for the work that we do in all sectors, and in particular in this very cross-cutting area of civil society and philanthropy. We do it in a way that is very locally rooted. So if someone was to take a bird's eye view at our approaches in the different countries that we work, in particular East Africa, Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, but also South Asia, West Africa, it would look a little like we don't have sort of one approach, but actually our approach is very much about responding to local needs and local aspects and having it be locally driven. So that really informs that the kind of underlying values are about self-sufficiency, but the actual approaches in any given country may be different depending on the local context. If we could advance the slide, please. So really since the foundation, there was Aga Khan development, there were institutions that preceded this. The Aga Khan Foundation itself was founded in the mid-60s. And that focus on self-sufficiency on civil society has been part of that since that very beginning time. And baked into all of that is this focus on structures, on institutions, on self-sustainability, and really providing infrastructure and supporting infrastructure in the countries where we work for people to take control of their own development. So that's really at the core of what we were doing. The focus specifically on philanthropy infrastructure, in a way that we could really label it as such. There was a big focus on that starting in the late 90s and early 2000s. We were involved with starting the Kenya Community Development Foundation in Kenya, Pakistan Center for Philanthropy, enabling environment work in Afghanistan. That was happening around that time. And we've continued to do that work, and our focus, some of the work that we're doing now is focusing a little bit more on localizing technology, finding kind of different ways of thinking about philanthropy and doing philanthropy differently, and providing the tools for really truly locally driven asset mobilization. So doing e-philanthropy and looking at diaspora communities and some of the kind of newer approaches to looking at how philanthropy works in any given country. If you could advance the slide. Oh, no, that's good. So yeah, we have in our sort of broader, what we call our community philanthropy work, we have grassroots philanthropy, really focuses on grassroots sort of asset mobilization, knowledge for action, agreeing with Nick that that research element is really critical, and then enabling environment work, which is where the philanthropy infrastructure work falls. We don't really use that term in particular, but that's kind of where that it overlaps with this discussion today. They're really all linked together for us. Again, it's all about local development, local assets for local needs with the end goal of quality of life. You can advance this slide. So what we call our enabling environment work looks at strengthening the infrastructure and institutions, facilitate and support local giving. So that might be, in some instances, that is organizations that actually do consolidate and then refund and kind of actually focus on funding specific kind of local grant making. But a lot of our work is looking at things like certification. How do we foster trust in local civil society, and what sort of infrastructure is needed to ensure that there is trust and that local, whether they're volunteers or donors, are empowered to share their assets with civil society organizations. Tools like e-philanthropy platforms, like blended learning platforms that can enable local giving and local asset mobilization. So again, yes, we do some work on, have specific funds that we support and work with, but then there's also institutions that are focusing more on that basic environment of trust, and then some that are looking specifically at kind of that in particular online infrastructure to support local giving. Can we advance? A few examples, like I mentioned earlier, KCGF in Kenya, PCP, we were involved in starting those and continue to be involved in partnering with them. The Yetu initiative is ongoing right now in Kenya. That's really looking at not at starting any sort of foundation or fund, but setting up e-philanthropy platform, supporting KCBF to enact blended learning courses focused on local asset mobilization and strengthening the local infrastructure for basically fundraising skills and telling stories to local people so that they want to give assets, whether that's in the form of time, knowledge, or money. We'll skip this one. Research and knowledge, just like I mentioned earlier, we do see that as a really important pillar of any of this work that we're doing, that kind of collecting the good practices and knowledge from the work that we're doing, both kind of informing it as well as learning from what we're doing is really critical. And then we can advance. And then just a final slide on a few takeaway thoughts for me about successes, challenge, and recommendations. I I think some of these I was trying to think of what to put in this, kind of what points to raise here, and I think some of it is, I don't think that none of this is very revelatory. I think it's all kind of, you know, anyone who's doing this sort of work knows this well. Systems work is hard, so infrastructure, that sort of, that what behind the scenes, what you need in order to kind of make things happen, and shifting in particular, like Nick and Oksana both touched on, shifting in particular away from an international kind of grant-making mindset towards really a locally driven process. That's hard. It's change. It's hard. It takes mindset change. It takes systems change. It takes time, effort, patience, and a really long-term commitment. So that's kind of a recommendation for all, is to realize that that's what you're committing to, and you know, committing to it. I do think that there is a growing awareness of the complexity of change and the complexity of systems, and as well as the need for them, sort of internationally, not only in kind of the philanthropic field, but more generally in international development. Not that we always act that way, but I think that the awareness of it and the interest in certain quarters to really explore and think outside the box and realize that not everything is kind of linear logic model-esque is growing, which is exciting. Growing awareness of traditions, that there's really local philanthropy is everywhere, and that there's different traditions in different places, but that it really is a kind of common human experience to want to give to others and contribute to your community. So how that form takes place is different in different places. I think there's a growing awareness of that as well. That's really interesting and exciting to see. In addition, I think the fact that there are different models of philanthropy, but also different ways of thinking about assets, that it's not just about money, but that there's time and knowledge and other ways that people can contribute, and really thinking about that sort of systems and power versus just about who's giving who what, how much money. So I would encourage, you know, keeping that mindset shift going. I think resisting the project thinking, this is not just towards funders, but this is also towards grantees. It's hard when there's accountability. It's rare to kind of have completely no strings attached funds, or even sort of volunteer time being contributed. So there's always some, you know, expectations, like Oksana was talking about, and when you get to be kind of working amongst organizations, there's a tendency to really want to focus on, you know, very concrete, tangible end goals you can measure progress towards, etc. I don't think it's not coming from a bad place, but it can limit thinking. It's not necessarily it's unnecessary, but it can limit your kind of creativity and thinking if you're really focused on this very linear approach when we're in this environment of systems change and complexity. So even not to say that accountability systems aren't important, they are usually necessary, but in terms of thinking of approaches, thinking how to work together, come up with those systems after you've done the creative kind of outside of the box thinking, and as you go, try to really think nonlinear, think systems, think networks, think collaboration, and then kind of can add in, you know, checkpoints along the way later on, but try to think outside the box first. I think assuming positive intentions, I hear often kind of at conferences, and you know, there tends to be this mindset of donors are bad, which I find kind of troubling given my own background and given the work that we do here at the foundation, is kind of being both operational as well as a donor and a funder. It's not really, it doesn't align with my understanding of the people with whom I work or with the approaches that we take. And I think that there's kind of on both sides, when there is money being exchanged hands, and certainly in the philanthropy infrastructure world, there's many layers to that. And I think understanding that or at least is one, assuming that everyone is sort of in it together and really wants to collaborate and work towards this common goal of a strong local giving, it's more productive than kind of assuming that because you have some need for checks and balances that you kind of want to control everything, and you don't recognize that there's complexity there. So I think there's some room on all sides to really assume we're all coming from a good place and that we're working towards positive change. I think that is pretty much it for me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Megan, for the presentation of the Aga Khan Foundation and also the Aga Khan Network perspective on that issue. So we still have about 15 minutes for exchanges, but before I open the room, I think the questions should be addressed in the chat. So I'm going to read some of these questions if there are some. Or you can ask it now. You have either the Q&A and the chat. So please send me your questions right now. But concerning the three presentations that we had, I think that one of the things that really appeared clearly is that for the three of you, the question of supporting this ecosystem, this infrastructure seems to be pretty obvious in a way. You have insisted a lot on the fact that this is something absolutely necessary, that the philanthropic work could not operate without a strong ecosystem backing it. So that seemed to be something clear, but beyond that kind of a base of action for your work and this necessity dimension, there was also a more strategic dimension that was referred to as the idea of a return on investment that Nick mentioned. But this return on investment, you've insisted on the fact that it's not a short return on investment, but it requires time. It's a longer term investment. And also there is a need to align the expectations of funders of infrastructure to get the results they might look for, and to consider themselves as partners of support organization and philanthropy support organizations, rather than a pure grantor and grant maker and grantee relationship. That was a point on which Oksana insisted. We also saw the diversity of approaches that you have operating, so that you directly produce the knowledge or directly support the creation of such support organizations, or through grant making, working on grassroots philanthropy or knowledge building, enabling environment or advocacy. So I think it allowed us to have a very interesting and broad picture of the kind of work and the kind of investment funders of infrastructure can do. And I think another point that was raised in your presentations that is interesting is the question of how to involve more domestic funders locally, because when we talk about philanthropy infrastructure in emerging market economies, for example, as you were saying, Oksana, it seems like a lot of these networks and support organizations have been launched with the support of international foundations or foreign foundations, and this becomes a real issue, especially maybe in countries where we see restrictions on foreign funding, and then how these local philanthropic ecosystems and civil society ecosystems, because Nick was insisting on the direct link and connection between the two, how they can be sustained on the long term with local and domestic funding. So that's, I think, one of the questions that we be able to ask. So I'm going just to see very quickly what happened here. So the director of the Arab Human Rights Fund is well, taking for the question of the fact that it proves the gaps and challenges that are in the universal. That's one comment that we had here from Samar. Let me see if I see other comments. Do not hesitate to write any on that. So maybe in the meantime, since I don't see other questions appearing here, I think that it would be good to ask further the question to maybe to Oksana about this last point that I raised, included in your presentation, this gap for local support of domestic funders to their own. How do you see that happening in Russia, and what, I don't know, what would be your advices, or how would you approach this discussion with your peers in Russia or in other countries?
Thank you for the question. I think that if we are talking about the start of new infrastructural organizations, for example, in an emerging country, looking back at our Russian experience, I would say it is more important to have at least either equal number of local donors who support the idea and are involved from the very beginning, or a plan from the very beginning how local donors will continue supporting infrastructural organizations once the international donors decide to withdraw their support. And it's, from my perspective, it's very important to do it from the very beginning. Because as we know, the Russian Donors Forum and other similar organizations were formed mostly by international donors. Among founding organizations in Russia, Nick could confirm that the Vladmir Potanin Foundation was the only one Russian donor who support from the very start. And this is not sufficient if we want to have a sustainable membership organization that have long future. If the organization is already in existence, again, I think it's very important to have a plan how to involve local donors into different activities beyond the project support. Because it's very difficult to change the tradition of local donors to provide project support to infrastructural organizations, but not the core support, that the one that is really necessary and that helps the organization to lead the field, to raise the awareness of philanthropy and civil society. I think it's very difficult, really, because it requires a lot of effort on both donor side and membership organization or infrastructural organization side, and it requires clear understanding, again, what to expect from the donor. You shouldn't expect too much, you shouldn't expect too low. It's both. And what kind of boundaries you set up when it comes to joint activities and joint support. We're actually trying to create a system how number of donors provide strategic support for development of infrastructure organization. You know, not individual grants, but a joint grants. It's difficult to set up, but I think this is the way to make the infrastructure organizations more sustainable. So it's not one donor voice, it's a collective voice. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I think we have just a few questions coming. I'm going to read one of these. So we have Lisa Goulet from Philanthropy Foundations Canada asking for speakers, for each of them to talk a bit more about the value proposition for funders. What are the 2 or 3 most compelling arguments that they would have to support philanthropy infrastructure? So maybe, well, I think Oksana, you already answered to that in a way right now. So maybe we can ask Nick and Megan to share what are their 2 or 3 most compelling arguments for supporting philanthropy infrastructure.
Well, I would say the first that's most evident to be is on the policy front, that we need organizations to make the case when, in particular, when sometimes rather foolish or misguided proposals are brought forth. For example, in the United States currently, there's been an attempt to repeal the so-called Johnson Amendment, which essentially keeps partisan politics out of the space of nonprofit organizations, and yet there's a proposal coming from the president's office to remove that, which would just flood all charitable, or would flood the charitable sector with with a lot of partisan political money. So that to me is the one value proposition. Unfortunately, it only funders tend not to get it unless there is a sort of a visible threat. But that's one thing. The other thing is that an argument that I think we have to go further on, and I think this requires some good research, getting some good data on really how does the return on investment improve when there is infrastructure, is sufficient infrastructure. It's the kind of thing I think we all know intuitively, but we probably don't yet have good numbers to prove it. But I think that you know, you see it on the level of an economy of a country that if you don't have roads, power plants, and such, that simply the economy will not work so well. But on the level of our philanthropic sector, we seem to almost have a blind spot. You know, I sometimes wonder how people coming from the business sector, who often then set up foundations, then seemingly tend to have this blind spot and say, well, I want all my money going just to the cause or just to achieve maximum impact, without understanding that it takes a little bit more surrounding that. Indeed, Benjamin used the term ecosystem, and it fits very well, that will enable that impact to happen. So that to me are the two biggest sort of reasons to appeal, but they're not. It's not an easy sell, and that is one of my kind of recommendations to infrastructure organizations in general, is to really work hard to figure out how to better message what that value proposition is. And I apologize, I don't have an easy answer, but that is an answer that is really needed.
I also do not have any easy answers, and second what Nick was saying. Again, for us, it's, I think for me personally, just in previous roles and previous work, and definitely here at AKF, given how central that focus on enabling environment, on infrastructure, and kind of on self-sufficiency is to the way that we work. I think for me, it's one, you know, something I might add is just how cross-cutting infrastructure and philanthropy, philanthropic infrastructure in particular, is to achieving other goals. So even for funders that really are looking for that sort of tangible, kind of tangible, photo-friendly sort of, you know, the kind of child getting access to schools, or that kind of very tangible feel-good outcome. Things like that can't happen without systems in place to allow them to happen. So it's not an easy argument, and it does take a little, you know, willingness to kind of sit and listen to unpacking what it takes. And I think that's something that we need to be better at. I think there's a, you know, this is a very kind of niche field that we're talking about, and it can kind of become an echo chamber. So I think that's something on us to really unpack that narrative of how you connect funding for, let's say, you know, in the case of AKF, a certification organization ultimately does lead to children having access to education, or to inoculations, or to better, you know, better livelihoods. So I think that narrative, it's there. I don't think we always do a good job of unpacking it. But I think that's maybe the connecting that kind of tangible feel-good outcome to the infrastructure work that you're doing is kind of one thing. It's not easy, but I think that's kind of the necessary way to really broaden the conversation.
Thank you very much for your comments. We had a few other questions, but the time is running out. One of the questions was from Barbara Leopold. She was asking how is it possible to reconcile the important points made about long-term work, intangibles of infrastructure, the need and also the need to think creatively first and not to focus on outcomes with more general focus in field on measurement and impact. I think that we had some elements of response to this question also in the feedback that you just gave us, and I think that really based on your last comments, it's really emphasizing the fact that there is a need first to, as you said, Nick, to prove this added value and to document it, requiring some researches. And yeah, there are of course some elements of research that can also already give some ideas of the impact that the field has, but it has to be systematized and brought at a larger scale. I will just give the example of the research that was done by Wings in 2014 about community philanthropy. And we found out that in countries where there were existing support organizations dedicated to the development of community philanthropy, there were an average 9 new community foundations in the period of 3 or 4 years, whereas in countries where there was no such organization, there was only one creation of a bit less than one creation of community foundation, which gives I think a good example. And then you can take simpler indicators, such as, for example, we gathered some examples through the 4Cs evaluation framework that Wings developed. We had the example of CAF in the UK with the Global Giving campaign. With this campaign last year, they have managed to raise £48 million and having 10% of the British population giving. And well, so with a campaign that probably costed, I don't know, a few tens of thousands pounds, they have an incredible leverage effect with this type of work. And if there is not a support organization that handles this and involves different partners around the table and start this, the £48 million just won't be available for civil society. So there are a lot of very concrete examples of this impact, but that's then our role to aggregate it and to make the case. So I think that's very interesting, and we really have to follow up on this conversation, including on how we communicate and how maybe we rethink this the role of the infrastructure itself, and maybe the term infrastructure itself, which is maybe not the best term to express all the dynamism and the added value of our field. So I think that's going to be for us a longer term discussion. We hope to convene other webinars in the future to have this type of exchange among funders of infrastructure and with support organizations and from different regions of the world. So we will keep you posted on that. The recording of this webinar will be available online, as well as the PowerPoint presentations. And sorry again for the little technical issues we had on that. And we will also keep the network informed on all the work that we will do around communication and documenting the impact. And we are calling also for your examples, your indicators, and your ideas to make the case for philanthropy infrastructure worldwide. So I will thank again very warmly our presenters, Megan, Nick, and Oksana, for their very interesting inputs for this discussion, and we look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. And thank you all who have attended this webinar, and we look forward to working with you.